Up. Excellent. Tim, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Fantastic. So everybody, I want to introduce Tim Kang to you. You really have to understand who he is. So I'm going to give you a little bit about his past so that you can better get into his head, because this is going to be an unbelievable presentation with so much information that I feel has never been presented in one place. We're going to talk about SSI, but we're also going to talk about CRI, TLCI, TM30-15, answer some of your questions there. But before we get too deep, you have to understand who Tim is. Tim started out as a biomedical engineer at Johns Hopkins University, who then went on to get his master's degree in cinematography at the American Film Institute. And he understands everything, not only from a creative side, from a technical side, but from an engineering side. And everybody out there knows someone who's very, very technical, but trust me, engineers can give you the why and they can connect all the dots. And he has also basically been every single position on set as well. He has operated as a gaffer, first AC, key grip, DIT, post-production color consultant, and he's also been a still photographer as well. And I know we have a lot of people coming in from Sekonic who also are still photographers. And so the only thing I can say is he is the best qualified person in the world to present the information that we're going to go over today, hands down, because he understands it from a creative point of view, he understands it from a technical point of view, and he understands it from an engineering point of view. So it's very difficult to get all these minds working together. So we're just going to kind of like jump right in. How you doing today, Tim?
I'm embarrassed right now.
Don't be.
There's another acronym we didn't mention. That was TLC, because TLC is one of the greatest R&B groups of all time. So
I totally forgot that one.
Yeah, I always have to mention them.
Absolutely. So. Cool, man.
So yeah.
I dig it.
And that's setting the tone for the rest of this session. So, we're not here to just talk numbers and cents here. We're here to just make fun of each other, right?
Absolutely. So. And there are no stupid questions. And we want to kind of present this information as lightheartedly as humanly possible. And starting out, the foundation that we need everybody to understand here, like the 1 + 1 = 2 and the 2 + 2 = 4, is what a spectrum is. Mm-hmm. And so, Tim, can you explain what a spectrum is, or a spectral distribution graph? To be
sure, yeah. The best way I can put it is it's the rainbow. So anytime you see a rainbow, you're seeing the components of light, right, broken up. Light is a combination of a lot of different parts, whoa, yes, that's it right there. And whether you go outside and it's water vapor in the air creating a rainbow that you see, whether it's a single or double or triple rainbow across the sky, what you're actually seeing is the sunlight or whatever being split up into what we know as a rainbow. So the technical thing of spectral power distribution is just a technical name for every single light source you see has a different rainbow. It's how strong are all its components relative to each other. And that's pretty much it. So that's the non-technical, hopefully clear explanation of what spectral power distribution is. So
I thought equating into the rainbow was actually excellent. So great, yeah. Great analogy there. And so now we want to talk about LEDs and why do people have problems with LEDs? And I think a lot of people have trouble understanding why an LED, let's say, doesn't render colors the same exact way as, let's say, sunlight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think if you can understand, if you have children or if you remember kindergarten or nursery school, if you can understand the difference between a square and a triangle or a circle, basically it's the same difference. When you have a different shape of a spectrum, you are going to get a different result. The most difficult thing that LEDs kind of bust out into the open is that we can't see these differences unless we have special equipment of some sort, right? But we can feel and sense the differences once we start using photography, or even just with our eyes, and we're lighting, let's say, even a store display. If it's a bad LED, your products will not look right sometimes. So we're seeing the effects of it, but that's the reasoning behind it is your spectrum looks different. It is actually a different thing. So
awesome. Yeah. And then another thing we want to talk about today is we start to get into some of these metrics so people can understand where we're going is they need to understand how a camera sees color, because a lot of the metrics that we are going to talk about have been designed around the way the human eye sees color, but not the way a camera sees color.
Yeah, exactly.
And so how does a camera see color differently than from our eyes?
Basically, the camera will see color with a certain spectrum. And in fact, if it's a color camera, it's using 3 different spectrums to perceive the world. And it's the combination of these 3 different spectrums that you get a range of recorded information to represent the world. So, but that representation of the world and perception of the world that the camera sees with these 3 spectrums does not match people necessarily. And as a result, when you have 2 different systems that that are seeing the world differently with the same amount of information, you're going to have differences, long story short. So that's the most simplest way I can explain just the big picture of it. Yeah.
So would you almost think of it as like if you have someone who's colorblind and someone who's not colorblind?
Yeah. So basically, yeah, and actually that's, if we all perceive the world as red, green, and blue, and combinations red, green, and blue, right? Colorblind people, the green and red sensors in their eyes basically have merged in their what they see in the world. So they're really only seeing orange and blue. They're not seeing green, red, and blue, right? So that's again a breakdown of the system. But in order to understand it, you have to understand the system. So, yeah.
So let's say if we were shooting with a black and white camera,
sure,
and we had a red light and a blue light, and both of those lights were putting out equal amounts of energy. But let's say our black and white camera had more sensitivity to blue than it did to red.
Yeah.
Would we see the blue as being brighter than red?
Whatever you're more sensitive to, and if you have the same amount of energy in that wavelength, that thing is gonna just show up as brighter. And so those of you who have done black and white photography out there, if you had a orthochromatic film, or if you look at all black and white photography in the first part of the 20th century, it was sensitive more to the blue region. So you had certain lights and the world had certain rendition on that film, and blue lights would appear more brighter, or and were more efficient, so to speak. So that all kind of plays in. Yeah. Answer is yes.
No, it's awesome. And so ultimately, how would you explain color science to someone? We've all heard the term, I love that camera's color science, or I like the color science behind these lights, or I love the way it renders skin tones. What does color science ultimately mean? How would you break it down kind of in layman's terms?
Sure. Well, just the phenomenon of color is really complicated. And it's a whole scientific field of its own. I mean, there's biological science, there's physics, just like any other, there's food science. So with color, there is color science, and basically color science is saying, how does color work? How do we see it? And how does the world create it? And every industry that involves color, which is a lot. I mean, there's print, there's media, TV or phones and everything. Anytime you want to predict what a color will do, like for example, if you want to be a painter or if you want to print something out, you have to understand color and how materials created and how we see it. So that, in a nutshell, is this color science. Literally is understanding how color works in a very deep technical level. So
awesome.
Yeah.
And so before we start to dive into some of these metrics and what they mean, to kind of give our audience here more understanding of how we kind of score color, what's the, there's a lot of people who don't understand the difference between a color meter and a spectrometer, like our Sekonic C800 here.
Sure.
And so how does a spectrometer benefit today's filmmaker in ways that a color meter cannot?
Sure. Well, the difference between a spectrometer and or a spectroscope, there's a lot of different terms for it, but between that and a color meter, like your old Konica Minolta color meter 3 or whatever that was industry standard for a long time, or even that Lumi sphere that attaches onto an iPhone or Android, those are cameras. So those have 3 filters. And they're another camera seeing the world. So whereas the Sekonic C800 is a spectrometer that sees the spectrum and calculates everything more accurately about light as a result more correctly, because you're not interpreting it through a camera. So,
and how is this more important for a filmmaker today?
Yeah, because a lot of so we have 100 years of technology that developed around a couple types of light sources. These light sources have a certain set of behaviors and properties, and over time, more artificial light sources came about that don't match that quite the same way. So they break, quote unquote, these theories and these the system. So if you use Konica Minolta, let's say, meter on an LED source, it won't necessarily be the right reading. It'll be the right reading for that meter, but it won't be the right reading for what people expect. And that actually became a big problem over the past decade or so, especially. And as a result, that's why I started getting into it myself. I kept finding that to be a problem. And now I took a deep dive and here I am.
No, don't worry.
Yeah.
It's okay. And in terms of Quasar Science, every time I talk to a filmmaker about Quasar Science, everybody has a huge amount of trust. Everybody really likes the color science that you guys are putting into your product and the end results. What are the kind of things that you feel as if though you guys do a little bit differently that gives filmmakers such an increased confidence in using Quasar Science?
Sure. Even before I got to the company, first and foremost, the founders of the company are gaffers and the lighting technicians and cinematographers, and photographers. So they already kind of knew what they needed. They needed something with good quality in terms of the color somehow. They didn't necessarily know the spectrum side of things, but they knew that it was important, right? And so having that as a priority already set them apart at the beginning of the whole LED revolution, so to speak, maybe 5-6 years ago, right? And they were fortunate to find someone that understood these issues and meet the specifications that they required in a way that created good spectrum. And once they understood this, and once I came aboard as well and educated them about why it worked so well, we kept going in that direction as a company because ultimately lighting is the foundation of the color of everything else downstream in any project. That's the one thing that it's really tough to fix. You can tune things out generally, but when it comes to rendition and stuff like that, a lot of it gets baked in. You can't really change it without having to do a lot of extra work. And so the basis for that is good spectrum. If you have good spectrum, it's a lot less work for you. You just get good results. And I think that has, as you said, that philosophy has borne out to be something that you trust, because we place priority basically on color science, on understanding the right thing, so. And the C700 was key to that, so. Awesome.
The C800 now.
Yeah, at the time it was the C700, and it was the only meter that was doing that on the market. And they invested in that as soon as they started out as a company and had that. So that was actually behind a lot of the manufacturing.
Oh, nice.
Controls for a while, because they knew that's the meter that, if you wanted to trust a meter, that was a meter for the film business that everyone was using. So kudos to Sekonic.
Thank you very much. All right, everybody. So now we're about to get to the segment of the show where we're going to dive a little bit deeper into some of these metrics. So definitely follow along closely. We're recording this, so you'll be able to watch it later. But if you want to win the prize at the end of this show, which is a free Sekonic C800 and lights from Quasar Science, a value of $2,200, look, if you're on YouTube right now, in the description, you'll see a link. In order to come into this room, you have to be in this room in order to be qualified for the prize. And right now, in terms of odds, I'm not a biomechanical engineer, but I can say right now, you have 1 in 200 odds of being the winner of a $2,200 prize. And those odds are pretty good from what I can tell. So now we're about to jump in explaining these metrics. Definitely get your questions ready. Keep your minds and ears open. And the first thing we're going to start with is CRI. CRI is the one kind of color score that everybody is most comfortable with. And that's the one we're going to start out explaining and possibly leave you guys with some questions. So right now, I'm just about to bring up a slide in order to kind of help you guys understand what CRI is. And so really important here, CRI is only looking at these first 8 colors, R1 through R8. I actually mishighlighted them, but I'll highlight them again for you here. These 8 colors are the only colors considered inside of a CRI score. And basically what's happening is they're seeing how well a light will render these colors based upon the way the human eye would see, not based upon the way a camera would see. And so at the end of the day, a lot of people ask you about R9, R13, R15. I know a lot of cinematographers, and maybe Tim could attest to this as well, will say, well, how is R9? How is the R13? How is the R15? And they try to use those 3 different additional indicators in order to see whether or not it's going to reproduce good skin tones. But I've also heard talk that the red R9 is a red that's even out of gamut of most cameras. Therefore, how could it even be used as a kind of a color confidence, score? And so that's CRI in a nutshell. It was kind of designed to gauge fluorescent lights, not LED lights, which have a discontinuous spectrum, as Tim was talking about earlier. It's really just looking at these first 8 lights, first 8 colors, and seeing how well they would render. And so, Tim, based upon that, how would you say that CRI could fail someone?
Well, you kind of just said it. If you bring up that slide again of those patches, right? Though, the actual score that you get really is based off of the first 8, and as long as you can just only get those very limited 8 colors, which are supposed to somehow represent the entire world of color, if you can just get those 8 colors to look right for the metric and not worry about the rest of the colors, then that's how you're gaming the system. So, and that actually has happened, and that does happen, and that's why CRI is it's basically it's what I say is it's a metric to tell you how bad a light is, and it's a really good metric to tell you how bad that a light is bad. It's just not necessarily a metric that will tell you truthfully if a light's going to be good. So if you have a score of 70 CRI, you know it's going to be a bad light. It's just all across the board it's going to be a bad light. But if you have a score of like 89 or 90 CRI, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a good light. Even if it's a high B, low A. I mean, but as an Asian male who grew up in America, A- is never enough. So, but even this CRI 97 doesn't necessarily translate to an A or something that you can trust, because you've just gamed that system specifically right there.
And so so you guys understand and have a further understanding of gaming. When we say the word gaming, it's when a lighting manufacturer tunes their lights to read R1 through R8 and give good color rendition. Whereas, let's say a company like Quasar Science or Tim, they're answering the question of cinematographers, and it's like, how do we tune this light to get good color on a digital camera, but also to get good skin tone, like the things that cinematographers are really looking for?
Right. Sorry, can you say that in a question again?
Basically, when you're engineering lights, you're not engineering lights for R1 through R8. You're engineering lights for what cinematographers are looking for when they create images.
Yeah, and basically, there's many ways to approach the problem, and a lot of companies will look at it differently. But essentially, what I found with looking at the science, and as having a science background, you always question everything every step of the way with a critical eye, and it's really what it boils down to is spectrum. The closer you can get to the spectrum of what you want, and the closer you're going to get to the result you want, a faithful result to what you're imaging in your mind's eye. And it's the same thing with, and this is a direct analogy to neutral density filters. Up until a certain point, neutral density filters, it was something that everything trusted, but knew that there were somehow issues. If you had an ND 1.8, doesn't necessarily, you knew there was going to be color shift. But even if you balanced out that color shift of that ND 1.8, something didn't seem right sometimes, right? And it wasn't until there was a company called Matomo in Japan that did the true ND filter technology that kind of revolutionized things. And now basically all the filter companies do this now. They did a spectrally flat neutral density filter that was truly spectrally flat, because they focused on good spectrum all across the board. And as a result, you get much more natural response. And that's the exact same thing when it comes to light. So that's where I kind of got the idea of it in many respects, of focusing on that is the more neutral your spectrum is to what you're expecting or wanting, you're going to get a better result down the line, whether it's CRI, whether it's whatever metric there is.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And so why do manufacturers and consumers still seem to trust CRI more than any other metric out there?
I think it's just familiarity is what it boils down to. People have been talking about it for a while. I mean, it came out in the 90s, right? So at that time, it was the only thing that came out, to even talk about color quality. So it was kind of the first on the block, and it did some good things in terms of it just gave that sort of some sort of way to just gauge, if I spend $4,000 on my lights, or a month wages or 2 months wages and invest it on lights, I don't want to throw my money away. I don't want to pay for it after the fact with bad it's the lifeblood of my work. Literally, it is the light spectrum is the basis of all the work. And if I spend all this money, how can I trust that it's being well spent? So that was the first thing on the market that the market could use, and now it's tradition. And as we all know, tradition is hard to break.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And just so people know, we're not trying to steer you away from CRI. We're going to give you the information basically at the end of this webinar where you can make your own judgment and figure out what metric is best for you. And it may seem a little obvious, and it may look like we're kind of steering you in a certain direction, but hopefully we're presenting the information in a way that it's factual and you can kind of use it to kind of make your own opinion. And so with that being said, the next metric we're going to talk about is TLCI. And so with TLCI, it was designed to kind of solve the problem of CRI, in which CRI uses the human eye as the observer, meaning it's basing the score based upon how the human eye is going to see things. So with TLCI, what they did is over in Europe, they developed basically an average 3-chip broadcast camera, which is very vastly different than the cameras we're seeing used on production today. And they said, we're going to take the human vision out of this, and now we're going to use an average broadcast camera. So it's a great score if you have a camera that has the spectral sensitivity of that average broadcast camera. But if it doesn't, then it's a score, as Tim was saying earlier, that kind of lets you know if a light's going to be bad, but it doesn't necessarily let you know if a camera's going to be ideal. And it's only based upon these first 18 colors inside of an X-Rite Classic color checker and how those colors are going to render on an average 3-chip broadcast camera. So if your camera doesn't have the same color science or the same spectral sensitivity as that average 3-chip broadcast camera, it's not necessarily letting you know whether or not it's going to be a good light source for what you're doing. And Tim, did you have anything to add in terms of TLCI?
Yeah, I think the kind of thing that will help everyone understand how all these metrics work is they're all analogous to each other so far, right? You've got a set of test color patches, right? Physical paints that are characterized, some paint chips that you can repeat over and over again and measure, right? You've got a light source and a reference light source that you're comparing it to, of what that light source should be, right? And then you've got a camera to judge, okay, you got a light source hitting a color patch, and a camera or a human eye will see it. And do these two light sources match? You know, that TLCI, you know, at least understood, the creators have understood this problem enough to say, okay, based off all this, and we're going to use better math to compute all this, right, at the time. But the issue, as you kind of mentioned, is it's a very specific camera. The camera is a broadcast camera that uses 3 chips being filtered through a prism, a set of prisms. So it's already not outdating itself. It's just making itself a very specific metric, and that's the kind of the negative of it. The good thing with that TLCI is they give at least a whole set of scores of what are you going to also see happen, what color correction things need to take place for you to somehow push things back to where they should be in post. So that's like really, they're trying to be much more useful, because CRI is just a number. TLCI at least said, hey, here's a number, but at least there's something you can try to do to fix it. And so that was the benefit, so to speak, of TLCI, of what they've tried to do. So does that answer?
Oh, absolutely.
Anybody?
Yeah. I think, you know, it's difficult to absorb a lot of this the first time. So I think reiterating a lot of information, I think, is very important. And saying it a few different ways. So with that being said, as we go to the next metric, we're talking about TM30-18.
Right.
And so basically with TM30-18, we're back to the human eye as the observer, because we have to remember a lot of times CRI and TM30-18, these weren't necessarily designed for cinematographers. These were designed for the lights that you're buying at Home Depot. These are designed for the lights that a graphic designer or a gallerist is going to use in order to kind of give a quality score to their lights, or in an industrial environment if we're looking at paint chips for a car. These aren't necessarily the metrics that would help a cinematographer, except as Tim talked about before, it allows you to have a little bit more confidence to know that a light isn't horrible, but it still doesn't let you know kind of predictably what it will do on camera. And so with TM30, what they've done with this metric is now they've included 99 colors so that it's a lot more difficult to gain in terms of a manufacturer being able to hit all these different points. But it is still based on human vision. And on the engineering side, Tim, do you see value in a TM30-18 score?
Yeah, absolutely. The people behind TM30 saw all the same problems that you and I are talking about and tried to address them. And not just having more sampling with 99 paint chips, they used much better math, which took advantage of the most at the time advanced color theory to date. And then they also provided a lot more charts and graphs to explain what's going on with this score, because it's not just the one score, it's two scores that you get, and then you get a color wheel of, okay, now I know that predictably, there's I think a great thing that TM30 did was that chart right there, because it says, okay, all in color wheel, it shows you not only do you get a more or less amount of saturation per color, but you get a hue shift. So on that circle, if you see on that circle there, let's say if you look at that the orange quadrant, one of those points, if it shifts towards the middle and to the left, that means you're getting both a hue shift and a desaturation of that specific hue of orange due to the light. So that's a very helpful thing, because then you can also know on set or in productions with your eyes, at least or production designers especially, or costumers, as you're evaluating paint chips, as you're evaluating fabrics in a store, then you can know, because it's hard to always it's always hard to just have your camera or even your cell phone. A lot of times it's just immediate, you look at it with your eyes, right? But if you go to a lot of fabric stores are lit with fluorescent lights, which I don't understand still. But TM30 is what gives you the ability to trust, when I'm in the store buying this stuff and spending my budget on this, is this going to bite me in the butt later when I show up on set and light it, or I'm on the day exterior and my talent shows up? Is it going to look right on camera? Was it what I expected for my job to result in what I hoped it to be? So TM30 is a huge step in that direction, because it gives you that ability to meter for that and know, okay, I can trust the lighting situation in this store to just walk around, and then I can make decisions, right? And that's called the RF score. And that RF score is analogous to CRI's score, right? It's how faithful it is to what it's supposed to be.
Yes. And so expanding on that briefly, the RF score is similar to CRI, but there's also another score called RG, which talks about how saturated colors are going to look. And it's scored from, I believe, 60 to 140, and 100 is ideal. And if you get a score above 100, it's saying that to your eye, those colors could possibly look more saturated. And when you look on the wheel, it'll kind of tell you where that increased saturation or desaturation would possibly happen. And as Tim was saying, if you looked at that graph, and if this red line here was going in, then you would see, okay, I know that this light source is going to have some deficiencies rendering yellows and greens quite possibly. So you can use that to kind of further evaluate things and see if you need to possibly use another light.
Right. And just to ground it in practical application again, just so that we're not lost in this. Let's say you're a theater light designer, right? And for 100 years, everyone's using part cans and incandescent lighting, right? Incandescent lighting is guaranteed on that chart to be a perfect circle, or very close to a perfect circle. So all the fabrics you chose and everything, if you went to the store and the store was lit with incandescent lighting, you can trust that when you have that same costume on stage with incandescent lighting, it's going to look great. It's going to look natural. It's going to look what you expect in your mind's eye. Then you switch over to an RGB par on stage. And that RGB par will have a RG score of, let's say, 120. Now, all of a sudden, all those fabrics will unnaturally oversaturate. You're going to have, two different shades of red all of a sudden become a very poppy single shade of red, right? That's the practical application of this. And so TM30 you can see it with your eye, but TM30 will tell you exactly with much more clarity of predicting how this is going to happen. And so that's why I think it's a great leap forward in terms of just understanding what your light is going to do and how it's going to bite you in the butt for your work, for whatever you're doing down the line.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. So I hope everyone now kind of understands, like, currently I would say CRI, TLCI, and TM30-18 are the most popular metrics that we all hear about. One second, let me just take that slide down. But there's another one called SSI. And before we get into SSI, I'm just going to do a little bit of homework for us here. Again, if anyone is on the YouTube channel and you want to qualify to win the free C800 and the lights from Quasar Science, you have to go into the link in the description and come into the live broadcast that we're in right now, because that's where we're going to be choosing the winner from. And so right now you have a 1 in 213 chance of winning this prize. And I would say those are some pretty good odds. And a lot of what we've been talking about, if this is new to you, I know it still feels kind of not tangible. And so the next metric we're going to get through, we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive, and we're going to talk about SSI. SSI is the Spectral Similarity Index. And basically what it does is it compares two spectrums and it eliminates the observer altogether. And Tim and I recently spoke, and it was developed by the Academy Motion Picture Technical Sci-Tech Committee. Sometimes it's hard for me to get the whole name out. So Sci-Tech. Yeah,
and it's the people that are behind the Oscars.
Yeah.
The Academy that you always hear about with the Oscars is not just for the television award show. Mm-hmm. They have a whole scientific technological wing or division that focuses on improving and preserving and archiving motion picture for the future. So that just to explain to everybody if you're not familiar with it. So
definitely. And so now Tim is going to dig into a presentation he made in order to explain SSI. And this really gets to like the meat and the heart of this presentation. So I'm going to kind of hand things off to Tim now, and he's going to take us on a deep dive into the Spectral Similarity Index.
Sure. And Ab, you can also jump in and draw and discuss what's going on. So actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the whiteboard on so that we can do this. There you go. Great. So yeah, well, I'm a kid of the 80s. So, I've been teaching for a while, and I've learned that the more I just dryly go over stats and numbers, the more I'm putting myself to sleep, let alone students. So SSI could be a really scary thing because it's just another set of numbers, right? So what better way to disarm nerdiness with geekiness? And in this case, I chose Care Bears because how could you get scared of Care Bears? So essentially, what's going on at SSI this is who I am, and this is my son when he was 2.5 in a slide in New Jersey. And what I want to also accentuate with Quasar and also just a lot of these companies, Sekonic even, and everyone anywhere in between, we're not multinational corporations the size of, let's say, McDonald's or Coca-Cola. Most of us are smaller companies with lives and have backgrounds in what you do as the customer. So that's why I always start off with this, is that we're people and we understand the struggle, and that's where this education is coming from, is addressing the same struggles that you have as well. So so basically the biggest concept that I want to, if you're going to take anything out of this, is not just the fact that there's a new metric called SSI. It's just to shift your mind as a artist to think in terms of color, of any shape and form. Is not just a shade or hue, but color is a spectrum. Underneath the hood, there is some sort of spectrum going on, or a series of spectrums going on. And as long as you understand this, and the more you explore this, you're going to get a better grasp of how to control it, and get a feel for it. And that's what we want. We want to get a feel and a sense of control over the right thing, so that we don't have issues with our work, unintended issues with our work. So what I'm going to go over here is the color science pathway. Okay, so when most people talk about color science, a lot of times you'll hear mention of color science. Most of it is a lot of times this. People talk about sensors. They talk about colorimetry. They talk about XY coordinates. They talk about all sorts of things that are really more with post processing. It's what's going inside in the camera and what's going inside in your computer, right? And the problem is that people then try to apply all this stuff to this side of things. But what we're going to talk about today is showing you that you can't equate the two with each other. And that every single object in this chain, you've got a light, you've got objects in the world, you've got a camera sensor of some sort that sees it, whether it's a human or a device. And then with all this processing and whatnot, you get some sort of display, whether it's electronic or it's a print, right? You get some means to regurgitate that information somehow. And then the final layer is you then have to look at it again and interpret it again as a person, right? So what we're going to go into is understanding basically this side of the world right here. Whoa, my mouse is going having a lot of fun there. So, and I'm going to clear that out. So here's a basic principle here. Light carries the spectrum information of your objects, right? So let's look at the first part of that chain we saw in the last slide. The illuminant, let's say daylight, the spectrum pretty much generally looks like this in the very top, right? And I have 3 sample numbers here. This shade of blue is relatively 100%, and green is really 100%, which means that all the other shades in that spectrum, relative to that, those are at the max, right? And then red is pretty high too. It's at 99, right? And as you get to deeper purple, you're getting less, or towards UV, right? Skin has, or let's say Asian skin in my example, or this lady's example, human skin has certain reflective properties of that spectrum. That's why it has a quote unquote color, right? So in Asian skin, 10% of the blue is reflected, 15% of that specific shade of green is reflected, and 16% of that shade of red, or kind of orangish red, is reflected. So that light gets absorbed at 100%. Only 10% of that is absorbed by the skin, and therefore now you've got an altered light spectrum coming off of that object. And therefore that light spectrum is communicating what that object is, right? With a specific shape. So you've got a shape of the light, you got the shape of the object, and then you have the shape of the communicated information, okay? That's basically what's going on anytime you take a picture. Anytime you have a light hitting something, in a whole series of somethings, every single object has some sort of spectrum shape, and your light spectrum is communicating that shape. So, and this is the basis of everything that happens with lighting in photography. Now, here's the problem. Our eyes perceive it, and cameras can perceive it, let's say, that shade of color. Let's say if we only think in terms of hue, this is the same hue of 3200 Kelvin light or 3000 Kelvin light. It's the same hue, right? Whether you use an XY coordinate, or whether you use just a paint chip kind of numbering system, let's say we perceive 3 very different lights the same way. Well, the camera has 3 spectrums, as you see. In this case, this is basically the inherent spectrum of the camera. And when you start shifting the spectrum somehow, you're going to change the shape of what that the camera sees. And as a result, you can have 3 completely different spectrums that look the same to your eye, give you 3 very different results on camera.
So Tim,
yeah.
if I could jump in here for a minute. A lot of times people think that if they simply correct a light's color temperature and take out any green or magenta tint and then match 2 lights, that they should get similar results.
Right, and that's and that's the problem, is that, you know, the reason why that's all we have to think about for 100 years with photography is most of the technology that we use had flat spectrum like this, and the filters we use had generally flat responses. So we could just think in terms of blue versus orange, you know, cool daylight versus kind of warm orangey, you know, firelight or incandescent light or gas light, right? Or, you know, when you have green bounce from trees in the world, you have greenish or green tinted windows, you get a greenish light versus a magenta light, right? But the problem is that, and so we thought that we just had to correct it with gels because the spectrum we assumed was always something like that. But even with fluorescent lights, or especially with LEDs, with HMIs, even with flashes, you know, or strobes, the spectrum, you know, is a little bit different enough, or sometimes too different, where you get something like that, where a gel is not going to change and correct these weird gaps that go on. So it's not, even though you see a perceptual general shift in color, you're never actually addressing the real problem, which is these massive identity differences between the lights. You know, the spectrums are different, and you can't, you know, after a certain point, do anything about it. Does that make sense, or did I kind of go off the rails there? Yeah.
No, I think perfect sense. I think for many years, people have kind of summed it up as garbage in, garbage out. Yeah. And I think what we're trying to explain here is simply, if you start with a light source that doesn't have the correct, or that has a discontinued spectrum and has this spectral energy with spikes that's all over the place, it's not going to act as you predicted for these light sources that have been around for years. And so one of the things when we're going to be, as we're talking about SSI, is as a filmmaker, you may have been using tungsten for 20 years, and you know how it gels, you know how it reacts with your favorite film stocks, you know how it reacts with your favorite digital cameras, and people throughout the entire workflow understand this. Now, when you introduce a new light source and then you go to gel it, you're going to find that due to the fact that its spectrum wasn't the same, or there are spectral deficiencies, that it is going to react differently, and therefore you're not going to have predictable results. And so one of the things that we're solving with SSI is, if you have a spectrum that you love, you're going to be able to set that as your new baseline and compare other spectrums to it to make sure that you get the most predictable results throughout your entire workflow. And you're not trying to solve for things deficient in the light that ultimately are going to cost you hours or simply just not be possible in post.
Right. Yeah. And so just to sum it up for everybody again, and this is I'm going to keep repeating this over and over again. Lighting color science is not necessarily the same thing as post color science. We've seen this chart right here, or you see RGB numbers in Photoshop, or to represent colors in a monitor, or more recently, what's being used a lot is monitors are being used in camera to light or off camera to light environments. Most famously right now, the recent example is The Mandalorian lit their sets, right, with huge, massive LED arrays, basically just big monitors. But if you only think in terms of this, you're going to have all sorts of problems that you can't address because you don't understand that this is actually what's going on underneath the hood, that you've got this stuff going on here, that the light has a certain spectrum, the object's a certain spectrum, and the reflected light is a certain spectrum. So that's kind of just to sum up everything we discussed, everything right now, especially for those of you that are coming in late. So if I go to the next slide here, so what all these different other metrics are doing is, whether it's CRI, TLCI, or TM30, is that you've got some sort of test light that you have. Whether it's, let's say, for example, this is an Aperture 300D Mark II, or you can get, let's say, if you're on the Mandalorian or using an LED or a monitor, that's got a certain spectrum too, right? And you want it to be a daylight source, right? A 5600 Kelvin daylight source. Well, this is what that international standard of what a typical daylight source looks like, right? And then you're going to have some sort of sets of objects. CRI has these 8 patches. The TLCI uses, I think, 18 patches, I think. And then TM30 has got 99 patches, right? And then you've got a sensor that sees the light hitting this object, hitting the sensor, and then you use some math to compare these two different sets of data. Does it match? Do these two different light sources match lighting these objects for my eye or for a camera, right? So that breaks down because there's so many issues. There's a billion different cameras out there, and let's say you try to do this adaptable camera model, right? Let's say you have all sorts of cameras that you try to feed into this. All of a sudden, you've got a absolutely really complicated metric. Then you have to have a metric that you have to plug in more camera data. Every time it just becomes untenable in many ways. And then on top of that, the math is changing, so it could be a little confusing there too. And so and finally, this is only talking about what we call white light, some shade of white light, whether it's tungsten or incandescent, or warm or cool daylight or shade, skylight, right? So if I go to the next slide here, so what SSI is doing is this: you've got, let's say, your test source here, okay, and gives you a score of some sort, right? In this case, this daylight source is 78. Okay. Now, this is basically saying, okay, the color temp of this light source is 5600 Kelvin, which makes it a daylight source. So the standard I'm comparing it to is the CIE standard daylight, which is called D56, right?
But Tim,
so those are the two. Yeah.
Could you explain to people what they're seeing, where they see SSI and then in brackets they see the D56?
Yeah, so the special similarity index of your light compared to this comparison score to D56. So my light compared to daylight, D56, is a certain type of spectrum, as you see here, which is a typical daylight spectrum, right? That score is going to be 78. So, it's a C. It's going to be okay a lot of times, but it's not going to be perfect, right? But what does this mean? How are we getting this number? Well, basically what we're doing is when you overlay these two spectrums, right? And you see all these differences here, right? All SSI is doing is basically saying for a given window of wavelengths, of the visible wavelengths, and I'm not going to get into the weeds here. Basically, the wavelengths that most photographic systems and the human eye uses, right? So this does not apply to infrared. This does not apply to deep UV. This is just talking about from a photographic sort of and human vision sort of range, not sensitivity, but just range. If you compare these two spectrums to each other and do some math to average out these differences, you get that score subtracted from 100. And if I go to the next slide here, basically what's going on is, okay, so I see that the biggest difference, it says, between a typical good, high quality, so to speak right now, daylight source on the market, the best you can get is 78. Because you're getting a lot of differences in the blue region and the near UV purple region, a violet region, because and that's about 1/4 of the visible spectrum that's being compared, right? So that means if I use a daylight LED source, a higher end daylight LED source, blue objects and purple objects, or anything or magenta objects, anything that has this component play a factor into that object color spectrum, you're going to start seeing color shifts of some sort. Or you're going to see differences. Or it's basically become, in this case, it's become more saturated, and you're going to see less nuances. So that's basically what SSI is doing, but on a very deep level. But on a simple level, it's basically saying, on a general level, no matter what camera system that you have, or whether it's your eye or whether it's a camera, this daylight source is going to be relatively okay, but you might have some issues. If you graph it out, then you'll see where they are. So the Sekonic C800, for example, it graphs these two spectrums together comparatively, and even just telling you from here, I can see that all these kind of differences are generally on that side of things. So when I see a score of 78, oh, okay, so a lot of the stuff is over on this purple blue kind of region, so I know that's where I'm going to have a lot more issues, right? Does that make sense? So, right. So there you can see there that how those two curves line up. The differences are going on basically, in the same regions that I'm talking about. So of what Ab is showing, yeah. So, so that's basically SSI in a nutshell. It's a lot simpler. It's just basically saying.
Hey, everybody, we may have lost Tim for a second.
Sorry, I'm back. Can you hear me, Steve?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry about that. And so, yeah, so basically, it's in a nutshell, it's basically saying, given my light source, the ideal light sources that's supposed to be, that I'm expecting it to be, and you can choose that too. So let's say I chose my comparative light source to be a tungsten light source. My daylight light source is not going to be even close to that. I'll probably get a score of like 50, right? Even if you use daylight, it'll be really off. It'll be like 60, So there's a lot of ways to think about it, and but ultimately it's a very powerful metric as a result because it's so simple and direct. And if I go to the next slide here, this is the whole range of basically of the white light sources we're talking about here. So this bottom curve, that's 2000 Kelvin. And as I warm up, these spectrums change. And then at around like, let's say 4000 Kelvin, we start transitioning towards a daylight type spectrum. And then up here, this is, I think 10,000 Kelvin or 20,000 Kelvin, somewhere around there. So here you can see how this is the standard, it's basically of what white light is supposed to be, of what we are all expecting it to be. And on a practical level, what you're going to see on the market right now is most daylight LEDs in general, for most products, even the ones that nowadays, even the cheapo Home Depot ones are starting to catch up now. They're going to have an SSI score of 71 and 78. And And here's why. You can see that region generally is being underrepresented, right? Tungsten LEDs, in general, the pure, true tungsten LEDs are faring a lot better. You're getting anywhere on average between 83 to 87 because that difference is a lot less reduced. And for example, in Quasar's products, we have 2000 Kelvin LED in our crossfade products, in our rainbow products, and in our practical bulb products. The 2000 Kelvin bulb is really, really similar. It's very, very small amounts of differences. Maybe a little bit in a deeper red, infrared kind of region is, but that's less than 10%, right? That's 8% of the difference. So we're getting great results there. So generally speaking, and this is what I found before joining Quasar, is that tungsten LEDs in general photographed better on camera than daylight LEDs out of my personal experience. And Quasar off the bat, back in 2005, 2006, when they started getting out there, their products were already delivering an 87 SSI, nice. Even before they even knew that SSI existed. And this is kind of retroactively. I tested the 3000 Kelvin diodes that were being used in their legacy products. It was 87. So that's reason why, one of the biggest reasons why Quasar stuff has lasted, because the foundation of good spectrum underneath the hood has always been there for especially tungsten studio color temperature lighting. Whereas with stage lighting, or let's say any white light technology, or RGBW, for example, tends to be in here too. They tend to have SSIs at best of 73 to 76. So the Sky panel, as an example, the RA Sky panel, generally speaking, is living in this range because it's missing, as you can see, a lot of information there, and a lot more so than a white light LED is. So you can see how it's kind of more accentuated there. And this is all at the same scale between all of these of graphing. I'm not gaming it or trying to poo-poo, let's say, the Sky panel, because it's still very useful as a light source on set. But just in general, depending on technology, you have pluses and minuses of tunability and expediency, but you start taking a hit sometimes in terms of your spectrum. And so you're going to have more issues. And so that's why I personally never, as a cinematographer, even before I joined a competitor to the company, never really used the Sky panel to be the skin tone light, because even though skin tone has less information there, it's still there. That actually is an important component of skin tone to define Asian, let's say, skin tone versus Caucasian skin tone. It's the blue region, or African American skin tone as well. So this is a really important thing to know, is that is why, like, you can't just look on an observer, you can't just look on color patches, because you start going into the weeds so much. It really helps just to have a tool out there to tell you, oh, the ideal source, which is a broad, even source, like an ND filter, is what I want. If I want that, how close am I getting to that? So SSI is right now the only metric out there that can do that for you. It's not perfect by any means. Metrics are still metrics, and I can get into weeds in that later, but that's kind of the nerdy sort of side of this discussion. So before I continue, any questions on your end, Ab, or?
No, I think it was great. And I think, as people start to digest this information, one of the questions you're going to ask is like, okay, now I understand this. How does it affect my workflow? And one thing that you can look at is, let's say, if you're going to be using quasars as your main light on set, and now you want to add other lights based upon the light quality of those. Maybe you want like a harder source. Maybe you want a larger, softer source. How do you choose the additional source to introduce to your set? Or if you were shooting with Sky panels, you can set any light source that you want to be your standard, your 100. And then you can get an SSI score using a meter that will then score that light. So if I know that I'm using quasars, I can take a meter reading of the quasars and set that to be my 100. And then I can go and I can measure 20 other fixtures from 20 other manufacturers and see which one has a spectrum as close to the quasars as possible. Because now when you start gelling your lights, when you start using the same different light sources on the same subject, they're gonna act the same. And it's not, right. And as a cinematographer, you're not gonna take the person out of the film because something feels unnatural. So when you're choosing the light that you want to light your subject, because let's say if you want your subject to look really, really healthy, and you want like a very nice warm light, and you already know you're going to use tungsten, then you can measure a bunch of different LED sources and say which one is going to line up best with this tungsten light. Right. And just give like a practical, another practical example and expand a little bit. Like this is Tim. I mean, so far I'm learning more and more, you know, as I go through this presentation. So, you know, I definitely want to just give you a huge thank you as we getting through this. And I'm excited for you to get to some of the visual examples as well that really show people how these things will fail them on set.
Yeah, and the other aspect of it too, that before I head into there, is that colored light also is a big thing, right? So when you add a gel, yellow gel, let's say, on a light, SSI also gives you the ability to compare your test lights, your light sources with what the actual color light is supposed to be. So in case an RGB color light, RGB LED light is going to have an SSI 40 compared to an actual yellow light, right? And whereas if I gelled a white light LED and compare that to what the colored, you know, light is supposed to be, I get SSI 92. And so we're going to see the application of this in the next couple of bits. So, yeah. So now that we've kind of we're going to get into more practical here. And again, I'm sorry everything's so dry and numerical, but let's get real here. So let's say you're building out your studio and you want to have all sorts of lights, you know, or you want to just test light sources that you want to buy, and you've got some stuff on demo and loan. I always tell people the best way to test color is you have to test the light colors, and you have to test the light, the objects. So you need to make sure that you've got familiar objects like vegetables, and familiar faces that you know, and knowing how they behave, because that way, and familiar fabrics. Because that way you have three types of things that you can use over and over again as your baseline tests for your own workflow. That if I have a test light source, I know exactly how these things are supposed to look in real life, in daylight, or with incandescent light. And on screen, when I see these objects that I know by heart, I know in my gut something's off, and therefore I'm not going to choose that light. Or it looks great because it's as natural as possible, then yeah, I'm going to choose that light. So that is a really important, simple, and direct way to start using something like SSI. So here's going to be, again, for the next couple of slides here, this is going to be the basis of what I'm going to discuss here. So tungsten on the left is my starting point, right? It's got a super even curve. Even though it's imbalanced, it's straight, right? So you've got a lot more, and once you balance it back out, you've got pretty much almost a straight line, right? And the spectrum is supposed to look like this once corrected and white balanced in camera. A white light LED, this is a rainbow, Quasar rainbow set to 3200 Kelvin. And this is balanced out there. So you're starting to see differences right here, you know, right there, and versus there, right? So it's definitely not perfect. And again, you know, this is quote unquote a marketing campaign. right now. This is really more, we're here to help you, right? So whereas if you just did a pure RGB LED, let's say a monitor, let's say RGB monitor, LED wall, let's say, now you've got huge differences with the spectrum here, and also as the camera sees it. You get that massive hole right there, right? How does this play out? Well, here we have, this is tungsten, right? And these are fabrics that I have. I chose them for very specific reasons, because they break if you have bad light sources. I like using peppers. The reason why I like using peppers is I bought peppers in a grocery store in New Jersey. I bought peppers in a grocery store in Glendale, California. I've had an assistant buy peppers in Eagle Rock. Generally speaking, they're very uniform in terms of their spectrum and color. And they have all these colors that are hard to get perfect all the time. Then you got chip charts, right? And so that's very familiar. A lot of people know that. So I have that too. And also their faces. These are employees of Quasar that I know very well. So and I've seen them every day for some time. So when I see them when I photograph them and I see them on camera and on screen, I know if something's off, something's unnatural. And so this is a baseline. This is an A7S and processed through my typical color workflow, standardized workflow that I use for all my own footage. That's DP. And basically, this is what a 1K of Fresnel incandescent light looks like, right? And when I go to all these right here, this is a sky panel. This is a rainbow. And this is an aperture light, this is incandescent, an aperture light, sky panel, and Quasar. You do see differences. The sky panel, this is the reason why I never liked it. It got a little too creamy, right? And again, these are all white balanced using the lights to that gray card. So there's no color shifts to the camera for neutral tones, right? So now you can see that there's white light differences. Because you're getting these deficiencies and overexpression of blue in the sky panel, now you're starting getting you're losing that warmth that was originally there. Is looking you're starting to desaturate the skin tone there, and you get it to a lesser degree with the aperture and Quasar unit, but it's a lot more acceptable to me. But this is still acceptable to a lot of people too, so that's why it's still a popular light source, right?
Tim, that's good.
Yeah.
Some people did ask what camera were you using to do this test?
I said an A7S earlier, if they didn't catch that. So this is the A7S, and I captured it with the Pro color space, which is a Rec 709 basic color space with S-Log2, and then I used basically a transform in post to a Rec 709 color space, basically. Basically a monitor color space, right? Okay. So again, this is a 1K, right? This is what is pretty natural to what all these fabrics look like. And I wish I'm telling you, take my word for it. But I've done this over and over again, and also I have these fabrics here, but ultimately this is what they generally look like and what I expect. If I lit with an RGB light source and I took the RG and B diodes in 3 different Quasar units, and I set one to red, one to green, and one to blue, and I mixed in the white light out of those 3 diode sets to neutralize that gray card, right? This is what I ended up getting right there.
Wow. Wow.
Right? Now, this is not unique to Quasar. This is inherent to how LEDs, RGB LEDs work, regardless of the company. So the color space, the inherent color space that you generate of the world is already restricted and saturated, overly so, to this degree. First of all, look at the skin tones here. They all even though there's different brightness levels, they all now become the same shade of kind of this magenta-y sort of color, right?
Yep.
Versus when I toggle back, right? There's different. He's slightly more pinker. He's got a classic, kind of warmer Asian skin tone, and he's a Latino male. He's got a certain darker shade of skin tone that all of a sudden everyone starts averaging out to be very unnaturally similar to each other. And then let's look down here, right? And I'm gonna zoom in on this now. Okay, so I'm gonna go to the next slide. Yeah.
One quick question is, I think some people need to understand the difference between an RGB, RGB, LED. Could you explain about the different white LEDs that can accompany an RGB LED in order to kind of reconstitute a white light source?
Yeah, so there's a dedicated diode to be white, right? There's different technologies to do it, but ultimately most of them have a blue diode with a phosphor cap on top, where then you get a full spectrum light generated out of that one diode. So most white light LEDs, or even whether it's now in this case at this point a Home Depot light bulb, right, uses that type of technology. The higher end, photographic quality companies, what they do is they have more phosphorus in there, so it's a much more even filled out spectrum, right? Versus what you might get at Home Depot. RGB is simply a pure red diode, a pure green, very restricted spectrum diode, and a pure blue diode, right? That you mix and match the brightness values, but it's still the same wavelengths, these spiky wavelengths, right? And all I did was just balance those out, and this is what they did in the Mandalorian, and this is what you see with certain stage, monitors, right? LED panel walls, media walls. You only had these restricted spectrums, so now you're getting something that looks like this. So even though I've balanced out the color shifts to the camera, right? Remember that gray card was the same in the previous shot. Let me see here. So right there. So the gray card, if you look at it, if you just look at the gray card, it's actually, and I also in post did a very slight balancing of just making sure that they exactly lined up, right? You're going to get now incorrect rendering of objects in the world, because remember, the light source is communicating the objects in a certain way before it hits the camera, right? So this is now baked into the camera. So now, if I look at the color patches here, these fabrics, all of a sudden, I'm losing all the nuance. The orange and the red all of a sudden become very similar hue to each other. The yellows, just they completely desaturate. And if you look this blue and dark navy blue, all of a sudden just become very kind of muddy. I wouldn't even call it blue. It's almost like a weird kind of bluish cyanish color. And here, the green and cyan, green is generally still kind of cyanish just because of the dyes that are used in fabrics. But here, now they're almost identical in hue as well. So we've lost all the nuance in our fabrics. So in post, how do you fix this? Well, yeah, you can somewhat have a secondary or have Photoshop or something select because there are hue differences here, right? But they're so slight that you're going to get a lot more noise from doing this, or you're just going to have to just trace it like this with a mask and then shift the color that way. But doing that means you have to trace it with a mask and take the time to do that, and that's a lot of work, right? That's already time you've lost in post to do that versus doing other stuff. And then let's say you've gotten, that's just a solid color now, right? So now, if I go to the next slide here, try tracing this, right? This is what it's supposed to be, right? And all of a sudden, I've got the wrong color in this finely grained pattern here. So if I'm shooting fashion and I'm shooting like this textile that has a certain very finely patterned thing like that, or here as well, good luck tracing that. Now you got to do a secondary. Now you got to do all this stuff. It becomes almost impossible to fix in post, right? And the other aspect too is, when you have this is a red apple, but it's got a little bit kind of more of a magenta-y kind of cast to it. Not really magenta, but this is a more, these are 2 shades of red, right? When I go to the RGB diode only example, these 2 shades of red get a lot more similar to each other. And so if you had someone else doing retouching for you, or a colorist in a film production workflow, they had no idea what it looked like on set. This is all they get. So then you could go through the whole process, and you show up on a color day or towards the end now, and you see that, wait, the dress is wrong, or the sign is wrong or something. Then there's all this work. Instead of doing creative work, now you have to do a technical fix to bring that to become more like this. Again, you're getting all these unintended consequences, right? And so the bottom line is that SSI is basically telling you earlier on in the process, not necessarily what's going to happen. Well, I guess when you have the meter, you can guess, but at least I know that if I had a RGB par can on stage, or RGBA par can with a 26 or 36 SSI for tungsten, that's what happens, right? You're going to get all sorts of crazy results that you don't like. It's not going to match your eye. It's not going to match the camera. You're going to get all sorts of crazy things happening. So that's hopefully a practical nutshell of how LED lights break. And this is an extreme example, but it does happen. I mean, this example came out of practical experience on set, something that I saw happen. So before I continue to the next kind of nuance of this, are there any other questions that you're seeing? Ab, do you have any questions?
No, I got someone said they love texting. Someone said their mind is blown, coming from David. Thank you, David. Are these images raw coming out of the camera, right? If possible, the color correct color.
Well,
yeah,
this is processed, but even raw, I mean, it's the same differences, and so you're still going to be fighting with this no matter what, because it's before the raw. It's like it's a game of telephone. You've already communicated the wrong information to the raw communicator, right? Raw is simply more information that you're communicating, right? But that information is already compromised by that light source. That light source, remember, is conveying the information of the world. If you restrict the information in the light source, you've restricted information later on. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah. And we had one question. Someone asked, okay, how do I use SSI? And basically what you would do is in SSI, you choose something to be your standard, or do you want to explain in terms of like choosing a standard and then comparing to it?
Sure, yeah. I mean, it doesn't even have to necessarily be, as you said, it doesn't have to be tungsten. Like if I own, let's say, a sky panel, and I've used sky panels for 3 years, and I've spent all this money, and then I buy another light source, let's say a Quasar light source, and the Quasar light source just looks different than my sky panel. Well, do I want that? How can I predict that from happening? Well, now I can predict how different it's going to be before I buy it by going to a store. I've got a sky panel, my sky panel saved on the meter, and I compare at the same color temp the store ones to my sky panel, the ones that match the higher SSI to my sky panel. I'm going to get a closer result, a match, most likely when I photograph. I'm going to have a lot less problems, so to speak, right, of matching these two light sources. So it's a Swiss Army knife, basically, to say, if I want this is telling me how much I'm going to get the same thing out of this new thing or this product or this rented light, So this is not something that really will come into play on set itself. Unless you're having problems, you take the SSI and you go, oh, well, that explains everything. Let's swap that light out for something else. It's a diagnostic tool in that sense. It is a diagnostic tool. This is simply there to tell you how to become a better shopper, how to become how to make basically better use of your funds as a consumer and as a professional, right? So
I think you touch upon. Oh, it makes perfect sense, and I think you touch upon something very, very serious here. Well, let me not be serious, but just important, is that you're using this color confidence score of SSI to make better decisions of choosing what light you introduce into your production. It is at the engineering level that they can make the appropriate corrections. In most cases, and I want to almost say all cases, there's nothing you can do to a light to really correct this, lacking spectrum. And on a manufacturer level, I believe what they do is they add an LED with the spectrum that is missing in order to flatten that curve as much as possible. Right,
and that's the long-term goal for everybody. Like the other thing I want to make it clear, and I'm not just saying this because I work for Quasar. It's just I've gotten to know everybody because I started a lighting committee to address these issues for the film business for the American Society of Cinematographers. So a lot of the lighting companies that make these products, Lightgear, Aperture, Mold Richardson, etc., they care. They want to get it right. Or light panels, etc. They just want to make sure that all this stuff works because it's good business for them. Their customers have less problems and then are more likely to buy their products, right? So they have a business and in a pride sense of I want to get it right? So the other reality is this sector of the lighting business is a really small sector. We're a knife cut in the pie chart of the business. So, but we need the most amount of quality. So to get things fixed as an industry to be perfect takes a lot of R&D money and time and engineering. I mean, you see how billions of dollars are spent just to make a new camera sensor. It's not quite as complicated as a camera sensor, but it's still a significant amount of R&D costs for an industry, for let alone any company, to improve this. So there's no malicious sort of intent to not getting it perfect. But this is the reality. This is the reality what you're getting with LED products. They are good enough, but there's still things that are gotchas, just like with anything else. With the conveniences of LEDs, you also need to know ahead of time how to predict these inconveniences. So SSI is basically a tool for that. That's as I see it personally.
No, definitely, I agree.
So before we run out of time, I'll just kind of finish off here. This is white light. This is white light, right? We're talking about white light. So let's look at now. See, most people don't do RGB white anymore. That's kind of a red herring, right? And devil, you can play devil's advocate that way, right? Well, but what people do use RGB for is colored light, right? So here's the most difficult thing to get right is yellow. Yellow light is really tough for LEDs to get right, and here's why. This is an incandescent light plus Li 101 yellow, or any fabric yellow, right? This is the spectrum of yellow. If I put that on a white light LED, a broad spectrum white light LED, I get a pretty darn close match to that, an SSI of 91, right? But when you dial in any RGB color mixing fixture from any company, you're going to get this score here, 27. Because you're balancing in this diode and this diode. You're not actually changing anything. You're just dialing in these values to be brighter or different. So here, camera sensor is seeing this. Camera sensor is seeing this. You see how similar they are, right? Here, you've got this massive gap here. And as a result, all these objects in the world are going to start looking wrong. And the color itself, yellow, is going to be also wrong too. And we're going to see how this plays out. So this is This is RGB. This is a yellow gel on tungsten, right? It looked yellow, and everything in the object, every object looks right. Skin tone looks yellow. You're seeing still red and oranges look red and orange, and all the blues lose their ability to look blue, right? Because you've filtered all that wavelengths out. But generally speaking, the world is as you expect it to be. Plus, it's a yellow light, right? And when I do this with a quasar unit set to 3200 Kelvin, it's pretty darn good, right?
Very good.
With spec, right? And if you do it for any white light setting, even with a sky panel, now you're starting to see that desaturation there again, but it's still more what I expect, right? But when you do RGB, we're going to get the same result as we did before. This is supposed to be RGB yellow on camera. Now on set, you can see the light was yellow, and you can try this at home. You know, set your light to yellow, and you gel a light, and you get a sky panel, or you get Westcott or aperture, quasar, light panels, etc. You set that light to yellow. It'll look yellow to your eye, but as soon as you try to photograph something with it, it's going to look like this versus that.
So this is actually incredible. It really answers that question. I remember you did a video with Aperture, and in that video, people had the question, is it better to gel my LED, or is it better to tune my LED to the built-in gel packs inside of it? And what this is basically showing is that your eye is going to look at them and say, you know what, these look pretty close. But on camera, due to the lack of spectral energy when you're just tuning in the yellow versus gelling it, this answers the question that it is better to gel a white LED to a color than it is to tune an RGB LED to a specific color, especially when you're using cameras.
Right, and again, a caveat is if it really matters to you for that specific scene, that the colors are right and everything's intended to be right? Because there's still a lot of conveniences of just, you know, dialing in this RG and B diode to get these perceptual matches, right? Mm-hmm. But as soon as things start to really matter once in a while with these colored lights, you're going to want to have that information there. So yeah, that's the practical application of that. So, and that's what we're seeing here. And if it get to, again, and again, here's all these lights are gelled, white light mode for all these lights. They all look yellow, and all the objects look reasonably yellow. And when I get to all these lights and again, I'm not poo-pooing sky panel alone. When you're doing the gel mode, all they're doing is just matching the human eye's perception of that light's color to match tungsten plus gel of whatever, you know, gel that you're selecting, right? So you're just selecting a perceptual color coordinate. You're basically matching the word yellow, but you're not actually matching the spectrum, the actual thing itself, right? And as a result, I need to be able to clear this. Let me turn this off. As a result, see, it doesn't matter what company you use, you're not going to get this here, right, on the upper left corner, right? So that's why this is so important to understand just what to expect of what you're going to be getting. Now, again, this is not poo-pooing anybody. This is simply just understanding what's going to happen. And if you understand what's going to happen, you can be prepared ahead of time, right? So what I've always had is I have a what we call it in the film industry, in the lighting side of things, we call it a jelly roll of party pack or party gels of all these saturated colored gels, and it rolled up into this kind of little backpack or a little like a fabric canister of some sort, fabric pack. You just have that on the truck or lighting truck, or you just have it as part of your kit, so that if you're in trouble, if you wanted to have a color and something's not coming right and you can't tune it right, you have a way to get there. That's predictable, that you can see with your eyes, and trust that when you see this gel on the white light mode of a light, it's going to look like that on camera. And all the fabrics and all the skin tones and everything is going to react the way I expect it to react. Because the SSI of that color gel on the white light is very close to the thing it's supposed to be, right? Yeah.
Nice. Oh, that's a perfect example.
Yeah. So again, this is just showing, this is what the tungsten space is. Tungsten is like right here. And this is the best you're ever going to get with RGB. You know, I've made a white light source of quote unquote RGB. And as a result, you're never going to get better than this. So you can change the balance of that color, but ultimately, that's not yellow. I wanted a yellow, and I'm getting some weird kind of shade of orangey reddish sort of shade, right, on camera. And again, all these fabrics, you know, the best I can ever get is this. I'm getting that same different, you know, the same similarities between here are exhibiting in these fabrics as well, right? And then finally, like this is the most offensive one is, again, you can see this is what yellow is supposed to be. This is what tungsten is supposed to be, right? You're getting an expected result, right, with gel. Because the spectrum is correct. But when the spectrum looks like this, you're missing all that information that this has there. So you're going to get this really weird responses of the world, right? So that's what SSI can also give you is now you can find and kind of game the system in a certain way. Like let's say you know that a light has a white light spectrum, a tungsten spectrum that's really warm. I can start tuning that light in a way that's going to start behaving more like this. In this case, this is the 2000 Kelvin diode in rainbow, quasar rainbow. I've added a little bit of red and a little bit of green in there. Now you're seeing that spectrum is getting much more similar to this. It's not perfect because I'm just getting too much blue. So that's why the SSI is 81, right? But the result is before this is RGB, now this is that improved result, so to speak. You know, so it's not perfect. It's not quite saturated yellow enough for my personal taste, but at least everything's looking right. And compared to a white light, it's yellower. So you're still going to see a perceived difference on camera. So I'm getting a better result. So that's the power of thinking spectrally, of seeing the color is a spectrum, not just a word. You know, there's a whole thing that lives underneath that word of blue or word of yellow, and this is what that thing that's underneath is, and you can see the results right there on camera. So the only tool that can tell you predict how this is going to be on a metric level is SSI. And just on a show and tell level, just so that you can start familiarizing yourself with these different spectrums look like, I'm just going to toggle through here really quickly. This is red, right? Red looks like this, right? Green looks like this kind of notch there in the middle, which is easier for LEDs to hit. Blue is either going to be a shelf or it's going to be this kind of mountain over here. Let's do it again. This is what blue is, or cyan rather. So cyan is going to either look like a shelf or something like this. And then blue is now cutting it off. So it's the opposite of red, right? And then magenta is basically the two different shelves. You've got the red shelf and you've got the blue shelf in varying degrees, right? So you can see that red and blue shelf, right? Mm-hmm. So that's where, again, you're going to see LEDs can start doing that a little bit better. So you're going to get somewhat better results with even RGB WLEDs. It's not perfect to this. It's a 61, but a D is better than an F, right? So at least you're getting something more similar to that kind of phenomenon.
Yeah. And if it wasn't overwhelmingly obvious to everybody, SSI is also the only metric you can use in order to score gelled lights by gelling an ideal reference. So if you took an SSI reading of a tungsten light source with a Li 0022 gel on it, and then you set that in your meter, that now becomes your 100, and then you can score other lights to see which one is going to give you the best saturation. So if you're on set, and a lot of times now people are gelling backgrounds to get different colors instead of painting them or using paper, you may have a light or a part of that set that you can't get to the same red, and it could be due to the fact that that light just can't produce it. And so using a meter, you'll easily be able to meter the ideal red that you're getting and then compare it to maybe a reconstituted red and be able to make a decision if you just need to swap that light out with and put a red gel on it.
Exactly. I mean, there are so many issues with gels, right? I mean, it's a physical thing. You have to put it in front. There's environmental problems with gels. I mean, you know, making gels is bad for the environment, right? You know, there's so many issues with gels of why we've gone to LEDs. So this is not just to say that gels are the end all and be all, but gels still give you the most natural spectrum of a certain color, because that's what paints are as well. If you're painting, the spectrum response of paint to light and how it changes light, or how light reads off of paint and how light reads off the dye of gel, that spectrum for that color is going to work. That's what cameras are designed to represent, right? Mm-hmm. So if that's what you're trying to get to, that really should be your ideal, right? So if you want a red light for a daylight balanced set, if you're using strobes and you want to gel a strobe, right? Gel the strobe and meter that strobe gel, right? And then you can start taking that as your reference. Or let's say it's sunlight. You go out to sunlight and you stick the gel literally over the meter, the incident meter disc. You gel the sunlight, or so you meter sunlight through that gel. That becomes your reference for that color for a daylight balanced source with that. So these are the practical ways that you can start with the C800. You can start going around, and if you are a lighting designer or photographer and you're setting up a big show or big project with a big budget or something that's really important to you, and you want to make sure it's bomb proof, this is the way that you can get bomb proof results. And that's the point of all this. That's why you buy a C800. So yeah.
Cool. All right. So
and that's it. Yeah.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
So now we are going to announce the winner of this
chicken dinner.
Thing. Yes.
Winner chicken dinner.
And I'm checking.
Waterfalls.
I'm checking the chat. So guys, this is kind of our 5-minute warning to stay in the room. We're running some algorithms and things in the background to see who our winner is of the Sekonic C800. So while we do that, Tim, do you have any new products at Quasar that you want to talk about?
Yeah, I don't have any pictures right now, but this fall we are rolling out a whole set of new products. What you'll see online right now is the R2 and RR. So the Rainbow 2, the second generation of the Rainbow Light, is basically got the same form factor, but then we also have the RR, which is colloquially, internally, we call it the double rainbow, but it's basically it's a double wide tube light. So it's not tube light anymore. It's kind of a panel, but not really. And the upgrade is better calibration, better lower level dimming. They'll pixelate the whole mounting system that makes it much more practical for use on set. It was designed for using this on motion picture and photography environments versus repurposing something from a different industry. So as soon as I started using our own products to light our commercials for our own products, it was like, where has this been my whole life? Right. You know, when you start saying that, you realize, oh, yeah, that's right, because we're making it. So it's going to be a big leap forward for a lot of people to have these products. And then we have some other stuff coming down in the pipeline that I'm not allowed to talk about. So
I like that. So
keep your eyes tuned.
Cool. So in terms of the winner, I have it text. And you have to be in the room. And the winner is, one second, I can't pronounce this. Jeremy, JLC Skyfox. I won't say the rest of your email, but Jeremy, you are the winner of the Sekonic C800 and the Quasar Lights.
I'm jealous. I want one.
So I'm sure we can take care of that. So everybody, the one last thing before we sign out is I want to give a huge thank you to Tim. Tim right now has a very busy day on top of having a family, and the fact he was able to carve out so much time, I am extremely grateful. And if you even listen to the way he talks, he's extremely responsible, meaning when he was talking about gels, talking about how the manufacturing of gels is not environmentally friendly. And the committee that he runs, he's in touch with everyone from the ASC. He is hearing all the problems and trying to develop solutions that not only help filmmakers, but ultimately make us more responsible filmmakers. So Tim, if everybody, I know you can't clap, but everybody really give Tim a round of applause.
Thanks to all of you for showing up and validating my existence as a human being.
He does exist. He's not just a myth. You can be a, what is it? You can be a biomedical engineer with a degree from Johns Hopkins and still go and get your master's degree in cinematography.
It was a career change when I turned 30, and now I'm 40, and I'm still a filmmaker. I'll always be a storyteller. I started off with photography as well, and as a still photographer. So everything I'm saying here is not it's not an academic exercise. Everything is coming out of the practical application of, I've suffered through the same thing you're suffering through now, and I will keep suffering through the same thing you're suffering through, and working with and dealing with, and that's where all this comes out of. It's basically, I'm very selfish, and I just want to do this for myself.
Well, Tim, thank you very much. And everybody, we're going to record this. You can rewatch segments on YouTube. And if you are tuning in on YouTube and rewatching this, we already gave a prize away, as you see. So have a great day. And everybody, thank you for hanging out with us.
All right, thanks for having us.